Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. So today is a good day for a Zoom presentation, I think, with the weather outside. Some of the places I work no longer, it was good during COVID and then they didn't want to do it anymore. I actually, for a bunch of people, it actually works out pretty well. And we don't have to worry about getting wet today with the rain, etc. So I've got a good subject for you today, Ulysses S. Grant, which is something that I always like to talk about. Like Lincoln, I mean, this really embodies the story of the 19th century and so much of American history that I think isn't understood as well as it ought to be if one seeks to have context for the world we live in today. We're so far away from the era that Grant lived in, where it might as well be, we might as well be talking about the Greeks or the Romans. But it's really not that long ago. And it is critical to understand, in my opinion, our country. The program today about Grant, I guess if you would have, if I was just going to take it from a military perspective, it would be one thing. Or if from a strictly political sense, it would be another thing. I'm going to do both of those, but Grant is that's a good example of why we need to understand the context in which he lived, who his parents were, the way he grew up, the woman he married, and the effect that all of that has on his personality. So that's the aspect I'm going to give you today, courtesy of the fact that I'm a counselor, and that's the way I look at things. Nobody exists in a vacuum. The circumstances of one's youth, whether or not you're happy at home, you've picked the right life partner. These things actually have a major impact on a person's behavior and their outlook. And in pressing circumstances, and I think that we could say that Grant was in some pressing circumstances, the way he would behave, hold up or not, has to do with some of those factors that I've just mentioned. Now, most people remember Grant. We think of Grant as the victorious Union general in the Civil War, but he's much more than that. Um, 2 terms as a Republican president. And how is his presidency remembered? Well, not so good, really. Grant was marked as an administration plagued with scandal. And the scandal was something that, of course, tarnished Grant's reputation forever. So was the corruption that created those scandals, does that mean that Grant himself was corrupt? In this case, not. What Grant was a poor judge of political character. And he had a lifelong weak spot of trusting people that talked a good game, and that in the army he would have been able to deal with under well, I don't know if they had the Uniform Code of Military Justice there, but you could deal with it in a certain way in the military command structure. But in Washington, D.C., people tended to be more slippery, and you couldn't get rid of them as such. And that's what destroyed his presidency. And yes, I use the word destroyed. He is considered to have had a scandal-ridden presidency, and that's not the way you want to be remembered. So it was Grant's fault because he was the man in charge, and he was the one who trusted a whole bunch of people around him that actually turned out to be corrupt and scandalous. And that was going to have some other major life mileage later on. There's another person later on in Grant's life, which is a significant thing that he trusted that turned around and threw him under the bus, as we would say in today's parlance. Grant's wife, Julia Dent, was a remarkable figure to Grant, and he married her with the actual affection and devotion. They were married, I think, for 37 years. She survived him, and it was a good, solid marriage that supported Grant throughout his lifetime. It was the primary love of his life, and it was very, very significant in this regard. She followed him to all of the army outposts, wherever he was, um, in these little huts and different places on the frontier. And she turned around and made sure that there was a house and a home. I'm not selling a Father Knows Best episode here. What I'm saying is that in the case of Grant, he relied on her and she added a level of confirmation and stability that was paramount to Grant's existence. And that's just a fact. So I'm going to go to my slideshow. So we'll go to screen share. And there it is. And I'll call this up. And let's see. So here's a great shot of Ulysses S. Grant. And, by the way, it wasn't an S. There was never an S in his name. It was actually an H. And I'll tell you about how that happened later on. It's a small story, but kind of like a fun fact. Good picture, famous picture of him. That is, of course, during his presidency. And what do you see when you're looking at something like this? Now, once again, I look at these things as a counselor. I mean, I was just telling somebody in private practice yesterday that I wasn't ready to see somebody she recommended via Zoom or some other way of telecounseling because I like people in my office, especially when I don't know them, because I want to see them. I want to see if they look in my eyes. I want to see when they glance away. I want to see if they're fidgeting with their hands. I want to see their body movements under certain circumstances. That's where all of the information is for me. And when I look at Grant here, obviously I'm not in the room with him. It's just a photograph, but I think it's pretty revealing also. He always looks directly into the camera. This is the last photograph of Grant taken at the end of his life. And he has just finished his memoirs, which is a very big part of his story. I'll get to this as we move along. And he didn't want to have to write his memoirs. He never thought anybody would be actually interested in his personal life story. I mean, that seems a little silly from our vantage point today, knowing how famous Grant was. But he was a very self-effacing man and didn't really think anybody would be interested in it. So I'll tell you the story of Grant's memoirs towards the end. So, 18th President of the United States, another example, of course, of a president who was formerly a famous general. Born in 1822, dies 1885. Cause of death, cancer of the tongue and tonsils, right? And he had by the time of his diagnosis of cancer, he had what was said to be two tumors the size of man's two fists in his throat. He could barely if at all, speak. He said that when he drank a glass of water, it was like drinking molten lead. And these were the conditions where he wrote his memoirs under enormous pain and anguish. It's a tragic story at the end of his life, and it's also a story of heroism, um, as far as his memoir writing was concerned. He finished his memoirs within 10 days of his death, and it's what kept him alive until he finished writing his memoirs. He is a very self-effacing man, very humble, something that characterized Grant, unlike many of the other generals that we have had and possibly even to this day have. He was not a celebrity general, right? I just gave a presentation on Truman versus MacArthur, right? And back where Truman had actually felt the need to fire the famous Douglas MacArthur, who was like a godlike figure by the time the Korean War was there. MacArthur was a celebrity general. Grant was the opposite. Grant walked into places in Washington or meetings after he was the commander of all the Union forces during the Civil War. And people didn't even know who he was. He looked like a regular soldier. And it was only till he was either recognized or wrote his name down that people knew who he actually was. He preferred regular soldiers, enlisted people's uniforms to officers, regalia. So when you see somebody like a General Patton walking around with his, resplendent with every decoration he's entitled to, and you might argue some embellishments that were, his alone. Grant was literally the opposite. So he says, I appreciate the fact, and I am proud of it, that the attentions that I am receiving are intended more for our country than for me personally, right? And there he is, of course, a famous photograph of him as the commander of all Union forces. So where did we begin with this? Who was Grant? What was his background like? Grant grew up in Ohio, and his father, once again, I'm going to throw in the psychotherapy for free, okay? But Grant's father was owned a tannery, right? So it was a big business back in those days. I mean, a tannery back in, I don't know, 1830 or whatever it was. Grant's father was like a large business. It was like owning, I wouldn't say it was Apple Computers, but it was a large business. Now, I don't know if you've ever been around a slaughterhouse or a tannery or something like that. I've never been in a tannery, but I was in a slaughterhouse. My grandparents out in New Jersey owned a farm when I was very, very young. They still had some animals. And for some reason, my grandfather decided it was going to be I don't know, strengthen my constitution, if you will, if I got to see the inside of a slaughterhouse. Thank you very much, Grandpa. And it was, as grisly as one might imagine. Personally, in retrospect, I could have done without that experience. Um, but that's where Grant grew up, around animal hides, chemicals to treat animal hides, stamping presses, the smell of, skins. Um, and Grant was, even though this existed during the time, those kinds of smells, because they didn't have cars. So all you had was horses and cows and whatever else it was. So people were more used to the smell of animal manure than perhaps we are today. But He hated it. And he didn't want to do this. I mean, Grant had an aspiration to be a mathematician. He's a smart guy and a young man. And Grant's father wanted Grant to join the family business. So now you see the dynamic. Grant did not want to do it. And Grant's father, to a point of, once again, like my grandfather thought it was going to be a good idea for me to see the slaughterhouse, etc. And the things my dad tried to do to toughen me up. I mean, Grant's father tried to give him the same sort of thing to toughen him up. It's Grant seemed as a young man to be without direction, right? So Ulysses Grant became useless Grant to the kids around the area where he grew up, which was in Ohio. And he seemed to lack motivation and direction entirely. In exasperation as a young adult, Grant's father says to young Ulysses, um, "Congratulations." And Grant says, "Congratulations for what?" And Grant's father says, "You've been accepted to West Point." And Grant said, "How did I get accepted to West Point?" And the father said, "Because I got one of my politician friends to nominate you and get you accepted into West Point." That is how Grant got into West Point. It was no aspiration of Grant's to be a military man whatsoever. In exasperation, Grant's father actually pulled strings to get him in there because Grant's father thought a military education and would add the discipline and the structure necessary for this young man. And in his writings, in those memoirs I was telling you about, Grant says that the trip by train to New York on the Hudson River to West Point, he hoped that he would suffer some kind of terrible accident so he wouldn't have to go. So that is the inauspicious beginning of Grant's military career. He gets to West Point, and the register says Ulysses S. Grant, right? And he says, "Well, that's wrong. It's not Ulysses. It's not S. It's H." And that was it. They had already marked it down. It was already in the records as S. And the guy at the registration desk he says, "Well, it's not H anymore. Now your name is Ulysses S. Grant." And that's how he becomes Ulysses S. Grant. It was just as simple as that. Um, yeah, that's a good story. So Grant actually in West Point, he is not the best student, not because he's not the smartest. I mean, there are people who study harder than others, as there always was and always will be. But Grant, one of the things, well, the thing that he stood out with, and that he was better than anyone else, was his ability to handle horses. I mean, ride horses. He was a natural horseman. I guess there's probably a more sophisticated term for that, a natural equestrian, if you will. And he was really good. He could do anything. He was like he could ride the side of a horse like the Indians did, hanging off the side of the horse, where the horse is actually keeping you from getting shot from your enemies. And then you could peek around the other side of the horse with a pistol or a rifle and shoot. He could do that and demonstrated that in this upcoming war called the Mexican-American War, which we talked about to some degree last time when we were doing Lincoln. And of course, that was the first real military service that the now freshly minted graduate of West Point is going to be involved with, along with a lot of other people who were going to be later on in the Civil War, including General Lee, right? They all served as American officers in the Mexican-American War. Now, here's another thing. Grant, he didn't like the Mexican-American War. He thought that, I mean, as much as people are allowed their opinions, but they have their opinions, Grant felt as though the Mexican-American War was an abuse of American power. In other words, what we would call today, I don't know, American imperialism, right? That we were taking our power in the Americas and we were literally levering weaker countries adjacent to us for the standpoint that we could. And that's the way he felt about it. He felt as though the premise of the Mexican-American War, which of course we wound up with a considerable amount of real estate in the West, the Southwest, including all of California, what was to become Arizona and New Mexico and Nevada, right? I mean, that's a lot of real estate. He felt as though, we went in under a premise and we went in there and then of course we became victorious and then we took this major land grab from the vanquished. That's the way he felt about it. How did Grant become sensitive like that? Was he a social justice warrior? Well, the answer is that his mother, Grant's mother was unlike his father, which was tough as nails in a sense, as far as a disciplinarian and being intolerant to Grant's lack of conformity to his wishes. Grant's mother was somebody that Grant adored. She doted on him, and it would probably be a situation where Grant's father blamed the mother for spoiling him or something like that, right? But he had this affection for the maternal side of his parents, right? And he just appreciated it. He had today what we would call emotional intelligence. Okay. I don't know, how much of a selling point that is to somebody in that kind of a man's world back in those days. But he had it, right? So he was sensitive and he had opinions about things that he thought was wrong. And the Mexican-American War, even though he was a soldier, he wanted to he wanted to be done with this as fast as possible. But you're a soldier and you don't get those choices. He was in charge of some kind of a logistical duty during the war, and he asked to be transferred to actual combat duty. He wanted to ride, he wanted to do something. He thought that as long as he was there, he wanted to be part of the action. And circumstances gave him the ability to do that upon his own initiative. And he kind of got a name for himself, you see. Now, Grant was always getting other reputations as well. I mean, he was away from his beloved girl that he had fallen in love with, Julie, now for 4 years during the Mexican-American War. He was away for her for 4 years, whether it was for the war or not, in total. So one of this long separations from now this woman who he has fallen in love with, led him to drink, particularly in another episode after the war where he was stationed in some remote outpost out towards in California. If you've ever seen the movie Dances with Wolves, and you see the main character of the movie who is literally just in absolute wilderness, you can imagine the kind of loneliness and kind of imposed insanity that might bring. Grant was so lonely not only from the circumstances of these outposts, but also from missing the woman who he had fallen so much in love with, that he tended to binge drink. You know, the historical truth about whether or not Grant was an alcoholic and therefore unreliable is overblown to some degree. And he got drunk periodically, but then, of course, he developed a reputation as a drunk. And he was forced to resign his commission as an officer at one point because the officers above him knew that he was conspicuously drunk, and they said, you either gotta stop drinking or you have to leave the army. And he resigned his commission. He resigned his commission before, about 10 years before the Civil War. So when he became an officer in the Civil War, it was because Lincoln, when he called for soldiers in 1861, after the attack on Fort Sumter, Lincoln called for people who had military experience. And as it turns out, Grant obviously had military experience. And not only that, he was a West Point grad. All right. And because he didn't have a dishonorable discharge or something, um, he resigned on his own effort. There wasn't any kind of major blemish on him, although the people in the army, et cetera, still oh, it's Grant, he's the alcoholic. So, or whatever term they used back in those days. Grant, I want to tell you about Julie, his wife. Grant, and I want you to put yourself in this place, all right? Think about this now. Grant's father, who was obviously a major influence on him, positive and negative, right? Just like any family of origin. Grant's father was an abolitionist, right? Remember we were talking about these things last time? I mean, Grant's father believed that slavery was immoral and needed to be eradicated. Even more so than somebody like in the terms that we were talking about Lincoln last time. Lincoln wasn't an abolitionist. He didn't think that slavery needed to be abolished, certainly not at the time of this election, right? But Grant's father felt very, very strongly that slavery was immoral. And Grant was used to a more he was used to the way things were done in the North, right? Now, compared to the South, the way things were done in the North back in those days, it was two completely different worlds. I think I got into this a little bit last time because the context is critical for this. The North was already like what we would see as a modern kind of an economy, a market economy, an industrial economy, where people came and they worked in, what today we would call a factory. Um, and the South was the opposite. The South was still you had the privileged class, and then you had the poor, and then you had the poor working white poor, but slavery was the order of the day in the South. And it was a slave economy. And so if you're an abolitionist, like the house that Grant grew up in, that of course was, you could parallel that to our political differences today, you know. And, in all of the places that I am and all of the places that you are over the last, I don't know, for instance, ever since Trump ran, you have people who are like, I just can't see, that's just who would vote for him. And if you would vote for him, you're immoral too. And then you have opinions going in the opposite direction with the same kind of emotion and fervor, right? That was the same thing there back in those days. It was literally two things that didn't fit together. And either you had one sensibility or you had the other. right? So Grant actually, between his compassion and his emotional intelligence that I mentioned from his mother, he also felt that slavery was wrong. But he wasn't an activist. You see the difference? He wasn't an activist. So his army buddy introduces him, Grant, to his sister, brings him home to, and they lived outside of, I forgot the name of the town. It's right outside of, it's in Missouri, right? Outside of St. Louis. In Missouri, the tradition in his wife's family, Julie's family. Now there's Grant sitting at the table, and there's his other army buddy, and you got the dad there, you got the mom there, and you got the sisters, right? And you've all been in those situations, or at least I have. And you want to make a good impression. And Grant sees right away that this entire family is thinking that slavery is the way to go, right? So Julie, who he is immediately smitten with, is sitting at the table. He wants to get together with Julie, right? But meanwhile, the father at the table is just pontificating out about, and I talked about this last time, the constitutionality of the right for the southern states to secede from the Union, you see, because of the 10th Amendment. And that the slave states were just fine and slave labor was just fine and there's nothing wrong with it. And the Washington, D.C. should butt out of everyone's business. And the Constitution clearly accounts for the right for states to have its own independence on anything that isn't articulated in the Constitution that is a responsibility for the federal government. You see, so there's Grant, and he's sitting there, and now you have this culture clash, right? You have this culture clash. So he wants the girl, so he keeps his mouth shut. You with me? He wants the girl. He's not going to come out and say, "Well, sir, I think that you're a despicable human being, and I can't imagine why you can, go on. How do you sleep at night, having people being slaves as something acceptable to you?" No, Grant wants the girl. Not only that, but Grant is living in a world where, people might be against slavery, but, it's just, you don't have to promote slavery, but you're not necessarily against it either, you see? And that's the world that you were in. I mean, a lot of people thought that slavery was okay, even in the North. I mean, just because you didn't have the kind of overt slaves tilling the field in the northern states doesn't mean that you want a black guy marrying your daughter, you see. So the North wasn't exactly free of slavery in a sense. So you see the social context that Grant is in with his wife or soon to be wife. That's it. Now, when Grant eventually has to resign from the army from his drinking, right? He has no place to go. Remember, he doesn't really have a career. You see, he can't fall back on something. He wasn't like an excellent barista at Starbucks before he joined the army, and he never lost the knack of making a perfect cappuccino. No, that wasn't it. Grant had no demonstrable skills. So he goes back after he resigns from the army, right? And where does he wind up? Back with his wife on his father-in-law's property. Now, think about this for a second. You want to talk about humiliation? Now, Grant is in a situation here where now the father isn't really happy with Grant. The father doesn't think that Grant is good enough for his daughter, right? Now, that was this Grant's father-in-law didn't invent that, did he? But Grant's father-in-law doesn't think that Grant's good enough for his daughter. But it is his daughter, and he loves his daughter, and now his daughter is obviously stuck with this guy. So he's going to make the best thing, and he gives Grant a piece of land. Now, Grant, on the other hand, is in a position where he wants to prove to everybody. He doesn't want to embarrass his wife. He wants to prove that he is, I don't know, determined, skillful, um, all of these other positive things. So he starts building a house on the land that the father-in-law gave him and his wife. Now, the father also, because this was the custom, gave Grant and his wife a slave. So now Grant is getting in trouble because what Grant is doing is he is laboring to build this house alongside the slave. And now this is a social faux pas for Julie's family and the society that they lived in general, because you're not supposed to be working like the slave. The slave's supposed to be working like the slave. You're not the slave. You see, so you see, Grant was already in trouble here. And he saw the slave as just another worker that was working for him and didn't see him as property in an ethical sense, even though that's in reality what the slave was. See, so this is something that, it was a constant irritation to Julie's family. And Grant he was trying everything to make money. He tried his hand in, he would chop wood and bring it into town just to sell it. So this guy's a West Point graduate, and he's literally bringing wood into town on a cart and selling it like a peasant practically. And it was an embarrassment. It was an embarrassment. But he was determined to have his own agency, and he was going to work as hard as he could. And as it turns out, at one point, when Grant actually did earn some money, he actually brought his slave to City Hall. And it was legal for you to set the slave free. You could give the slave his walking papers, which Grant did. He walks in with his slave and he signs the paperwork to give that slave his freedom. And people are looking at him like he's nuts. Like, what are you, crazy? I mean, this is something that wasn't done. And it just wasn't done. This slave had an unlimited potential to bring back profit, essentially, because you owned it. And any work that the slave did, you it was your money because you owned the slave. You see, now if you got another slave, a female slave, and you made a bunch of little slaves, right? Then all of the profit from those slaves would be yours. You see, so it was an unlimited amount of money. So people thought he was crazy, and he got a lot of pushback where he was back in St. Louis for this. But he didn't care. He did it. And he signed the paperwork, and the slave was set free. He got his walking papers. So, so Grant now, he needs a job. His father, still in the tannery industry, gives him a job at a field office in, I guess, what today you would call a leather goods store, right? So all of the product of the tannery, and you can imagine how much accessories existed back in those days made out of leather for horses, because the entire transportation economy, agricultural economy, all relied on horses. I mean, so it was a pretty damn big deal. Um, but he is now just a nameless, faceless person who is, I don't know, just selling stuff at a retail store, right? This West Point graduate, but at least he had a job. You see, now in 1861, where this period of time is now, we have Fort Sumner being fired upon by South Carolina forces. And the Civil War essentially has now begun. And the President Abraham Lincoln calls out for troops, right? Now, this isn't something that actually flies across your smartphone, news has to travel, etc. And one of Grant's friends, who was also part of the militia, right, says to him, President Lincoln is calling for troops. The Civil War has begun. Now, what I want to show you right now is I want to give you some insight about what this meant to Grant. This wasn't just some event. Oh, well, all right. Well, there's a civil war now. Yeah, I've got military experience. Sure, I'll go. That's not what it was. And that's why what I try to give in some of these presentations. I like these pieces of what I would consider insight onto this. What made this such a crusade for Grant, right? Because you all know that if for motivation, if you believe in something, you're going to have energy where other people fail because you're pushed by your emotions about, well, let's call it the righteousness of your cause. So what made, let's use the term keeping the Union together, right? Because the Civil War wasn't about slavery right then. It was about keeping the Union together. If you asked any Union soldier, why am I enlisting today? It's to keep the Union together. You weren't going to get people who were saying, well, I think it's very, very wrong what's been happening to the African Americans in our community. And I think that we need to have restorative justice. You're not going to hear that. What you heard was that you're going to preserve the Union, right? And that was the way Grant saw it. And so what was the big motivation here, right? Why the emotional, I got to join the army again? And here it is, right? And it's, for me at least, I never thought about this until I started studying this. It's from generationally. Grant's father was back, he remembered the Revolutionary War. See, that's the thing with this generation. Now, this is very, very important generationally, right? So, for instance, I don't know, my father was young, but he was in World War II in the Pacific, right? As a young man. He was there I think he lied about his age, right? Whatever. But he was in the Philippines in 1945, waiting for the invasion of Japan, which didn't happen, whatever. My father is a World War II Navy veteran. And then he got called in because he was in the reserves and they called him back in after Korea started, right? So, so whatever stories about that, was kind of like once removed firsthand for me, you see? So I had a closeness to it because my father was a direct participant, if you will. Same thing like people my age I remember Holocaust survivors, right? That were still young, raising other, people, etc. I remember the numbers on their arms and things like that, right? So do you probably, um, if you grew up where I grew up. And this was a big deal. I mean, and nobody's going to tell me the Holocaust didn't happen, you know, and but all of these years later, generations later, there's that separation. You see, that's what I'm trying to impress upon you here. For Grant, his father was part of that. His father, Grant's father, the guy who owned the tannery, was an American patriot, somebody who was in favor of fighting the American Revolutionary War to break away from tyranny, right? And then the whole, I don't know, sense of ethic and patriotism and ideology that went along with the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution, and this notion that I don't think that its imperfections were as pronounced as far as public knowledge as they are today, of course, right? Vis-a-vis, you know, the slavery and the keeping women from being able to vote, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? But back then, And even today, those who are in favor of the American experiment say this is the greatest single experiment that the world has ever seen in self-governance. See, that's the point. And it's sacred. It is sacred. You know, the first time in history that people were given the average individual, no matter who you were, had the, at least on paper, right, the ability to pursue happiness, which means that you practically had free agency. That never happened in any society on the face of the earth up until that point. And of course, and we're still trying to tweak that to make sure that it exists for everybody today, right? But that was a sacred thing for Grant's father. And so when that guy walked into the leather shop or whatever you want to call it that Grant was working, right? And he said that the South have fired on Fort Sumter. That triggered something in Grant that was at his core that this cannot allow to we cannot allow the Union to break apart. That would be a cardinal sin because the Union and the United States of America, right? The Union is the greatest single experiment in history. It cannot be allowed to fail. It cannot be allowed to fail. And Grant got that because of the proximity to his father's generation in this case. And that's why Grant felt so necessary. He immediately joined the army and he was reinstated into some certain rank and he made to general, before long. And he was placed out what they called out west. And out west during the Civil War was the Mississippi River. See, but I wanted to make that point to you about what made this so important for Grant and an entire generation of men who joined up, you know. They, from Grant's standpoint, I mean, he wasn't a social justice warrior. He felt that the Union, it was sacred and could not be allowed to be torn apart for the whatever, something that could have been negotiated in politics. So the idea that you were going to rip the country in half and destroy the American experiment was intolerable, right? That's the point I wanted to bring to you via Grant. Yeah, I don't know what this thing is that people put their hand in their jacket. That seemed to be a thing back in the 19th century. I mean, my joke always is like, oh, well, maybe he's going to check his text messages. Now, another thing that Grant is famous for. Remember last time I showed you a photograph of, the painting called The Peacemaker. So you had Lincoln, and now you've got Grant, who is the commander of all of the Union forces, right? Having replaced McClellan, and there were about two other people before Grant, because before Grant was placed in charge of all Union forces. Um, it was Grant who was the point man during the surrender of Lee at Appomattox, where Grant said, Lee asked him, what are your terms? What are your surrender terms? And basically it could have been anything. It could have been anything. I mean, Grant could have said, well, you have to surrender everything and we're taking all your property and you're all prisoners, right? That would have been the punitive thing to do. I think I covered some of that last time. But Grant was carrying out Lincoln's sentiment that we have to be generous. We have to be benevolent to those who were 10 minutes ago were our sworn enemies, right? Because we're all Americans. This is a very unique period of time, right? Very unique period of time. And as a matter of fact, from my vantage point, with I mentioned before, some of the passions involved in the last presidency, presidential election. I mean, it's like, on one hand, you're watching television. I'm just taking a position here. I'm just making an observation. And it's, you have some pundits and politicians saying, well, if Trump is elected, it's going to be the end of the earth and there's not going to be any more elections and it's going to be immediate tyranny and the Constitution is going to be dissolved and all the rest of this, in very apocalyptic terms. And then one of the things, as you might have noticed, is that, I mean, just look how Biden invited Donald Trump to the White House. And it was like, okay, all right, so I'm going to be on the way out and you're coming in. And, here's what I think is important, right? I mean, it's just like, boom, you got, it's kind of like 5 minutes ago, it was the two couldn't possibly reconcile anything. And now it's kind of like, all right, well, we're one country and we've got to, somehow coexist, you see? That is, I think that's a legitimate parallel. Of course, in the American Civil War, through 630,000 soldiers got killed, right? That's not a small thing. So, but Grant said to Lee, here are my terms, right? You go home. If that gun belongs to you, take it with you. If that horse belongs to you, take it with you. And this goes for the entire Confederate Army. You're going to need the horse to put things back together. You see? And it was remarkable how lenient the terms were. You see, because right from the get-go, you're trying to reconcile. Now, there were a lot of screw-ups that were during the period called Reconstruction, right? Most notably at the hands of Lincoln's successor, Johnson, okay, which is worth an entire presentation by itself. And there were a lot of abuses that occurred during the Reconstruction period, which created all kinds of animosity towards the North, and justifiably so. And in Congress and everything else. All right. So Grant was president and served during the critical time of Reconstruction, right? Not the 13th Amendment, but the 14th and the 15th Amendment. Very, very important, right? The 14th and 15th Amendment, two things, especially the 14th, which we're still talking about right to this moment. The 14th Amendment is in the news today. Advocated rights for the freedman meaning freed slaves, right? Remember the conditions here. I mean, if you were a Southerner and you lost the Civil War, which you did, right? And now the 13th Amendment said that this black guy who 10 minutes ago was your property is now like what, your equal? That's a bridge too far. If you were a Southern person, you've probably been raised all your life to think that that was just insane. You see? So, saying that you might have rights for the freedman, but saying that somebody has full agency and habeas corpus of the United States government as a citizen and everything else like that, this is an entire thing. You can't comprehend it. You're saying that somebody who was like the status of an animal is now your equal, So the South had a real hard time with all of this. It took a long time. And, many would say that the journey isn't finished yet. Okay. That's not the point of my presentation today. I'm just adding some context. Opposed retribution directed at the defeated South, right? You've got a lot of people on the European model. Remember, this is the middle of the 19th century. And the way it was done in Europe, as like I told you last time, it was look at the Treaty of Versailles, which was in the 20th century, and it was like, well, we won, and therefore we get to tell you what to do. And by the way, we're taking your stuff, you see? And you're going to have to sign something saying that all of this was your fault and everything that we lost monetarily and everything else like that. We're going to have to basically sanction you and confiscate from you. You see, and that, of course, just created World War II right on the spot. That is the opposite of what happened at the American Civil War at the hands of Grant, and Lee, and certainly when he was president. Now, when he became president, a lot of damage had already been done by the Johnson administration, particularly, as I mentioned to you. So he had some, major cleanup to do. And like I said to you, he wasn't as good a politician, Grant, as he was a general, right? A lot of stamps. I like stamps. Series 1902, right? So this is commemorating him 1822, 1885, 4 cents. That's probably not a regular stamp, right? In 1902, you could like probably mail a Model T across the United States for 4 cents. I don't know. I know that's a grandiose overstatement. Let me give you a couple of quotes. Quotes are always good. Um, Leave the matter of religion to the family altar, the church and the private schools, supported entirely by private contributions, keep the church and state forever separate. Right? That's him speaking in Des Moines, Iowa, 1875. Grant is not the founding generation, as I mentioned to you before. Grant was more like Lincoln was. He believed in God, but it didn't come out of his mouth in every single sentence that he was talking about, right? And there you have a clear separation of church and state. Though I have been trained as a soldier and participated in many battles, there never was a time when, in my opinion, some way could not be found to prevent the drawing of the sword. I look forward to an epoch when a court recognized by all nations will settle international differences. So this is kind of prophetic, and you can see that. Well, what he's talking about. He's talking primarily about the Mexican-American War, all right? But nevertheless, at the end of World War I, just such recognition that we need to have some kind of an international body where you can have a forum of discussion instead of immediately resorting to military means. All right, and that was the League of Nations, which of course turned out to be, I don't know, maybe useless isn't the unfair. Okay, and then that's why the United Nations was given so much promise after World War II, because if the United Nations fails, post World War II, the way the League of Nations failed after World War I, well, now our lives are all going to be over. Why? Because now we have nuclear weapons. You see? So you can't have another World War II setup, which is going to trigger a domino effect of a world war, which some people might say has occurred in our current time, because the specter of nuclear weapons would literally mean our own destruction. But he's talking a long time ago here, right? We need to have an international organization. Here's another stamp, 8 cents, right? It doesn't say what this is. This is a nice stamp, though, isn't it? It was my fortune, he says, or misfortune, to be called to the office of chief executive without any previous political training. So, another parallel, you might say, to current events. Here's a guy who is not a professional politician. He was a military officer, you see? He lands in Washington, D.C. as somebody who doesn't know how things are really run. He doesn't know how things are really run, and people take advantage of him. He brings people in that he thinks from if this was a military construct, they would have been okay. He would have been able to control them. He would have known what was going on. But in the standpoint of politics, he didn't know what was going on. It was too easy to, I don't know, lie. It was too easy to not have accountability. It was too easy to make it seem like you were doing one thing. But in the military, you got to get something done. You're either winning or you're not winning, assuming we're talking about a war. But what Grant found was that in Washington, D.C., there was so much diffuseness that accountability wasn't there. And he, with his Achilles heel of being too trusting of people who talked a good game, they took advantage for their own personal political gain at Grant's expense. And Grant is still today considered to be maybe a failed presidency would be wrong, but it certainly isn't something where he seemed like he was in control. You see? Now that's sad, but that's all right. Now, the United States, this is from 1995, which is a different world, right? In the post 2020 George Floyd world, right? People who are part of our Confederate history, right? And I include Confederate history in our history, the history of the United States, because it wasn't a different planet. They were other Americans. And in the period during Reconstruction, it was very, very important to put the country back together. So, like I tried to talk before, you were trying to thread a needle societally and governmentally, where you have to reincorporate people who were fighting with honor in the South, right? Well, or what they perceived as honor, and reincorporate them into the fabric of the military and the government, the and society as our equals, you see. But it's a difficult thing to do. It's still difficult, you know. So in our more recent history, we just turned around and carte blanched and canceled anyone who you might say fought bravely, right, for the Confederacy. Because if you're saying that they fought bravely for the Confederacy, that means that you are in effect supporting slavery, right? Or you're whitewashing what they were supposedly being brave fighting, you see. And, this is it's a current problem. It certainly is a problem for somebody who's a historian, right? Um, but anyway, Lee, I mean, this is a big deal. Lee was somebody who remembered, or Grant remembered Lee from the Mexican-American War, you see. As a matter of fact, during Appomattox, where Lee now is surrendering his sword to Grant, Grant is, I don't know, in kind of like this handed way of making conversation, says, I don't know if you remember me, but we met, someplace in the Mexican-American War, see? And then Lee turns around and basically disses him, as it's a term we would use today, disrespects him by saying, well, no, I don't really remember you. So you could see the kind of power play you have here. It's kind of like, yeah, I just lost the entire war and the cause of the Confederacy. Don't expect me to like pat you on the back or make small conversation with you. You see, was the age of chivalry, etc. But he doesn't have to do anything he doesn't want to do, and probably didn't remember Grant anyway. See, remember I telling you when Grant's buddy came in and said, I'm looking for somebody to join our militia, because Lincoln has now called for troops in 1861, right? And Grant goes ahead and he rejoins the army. This is Grant's quote. There are but two parties now, right? In other words, not Republicans or Whigs, Republicans and Democrats. So this is his statement. There are but two parties now, traitors and patriots. You see how you might consider this an oversimplification, but remember, don't make the mistake of presentism where we're looking at things that happened to them with the lens of how we perceive things today, right? There are but two parties now, traitors and patriots, and I want hereafter to be ranked with the latter, and I trust the stronger party. So the people who were part of, they didn't call it, they called it a rebellion, right? The South seceding from the Union. They are now traitors. Traitors. So you see how Grant feels about this. It's not about slavery to him. It is about breaking up the Union, which is a form of heresy for a patriot, somebody with any kind of revolutionary background, which people from the South did, you know. Here is Grant saying something that I described to you before. Um, I never was an abolitionist, not even what could be called anti-slavery, but I try to judge fairly and honestly, and it become patent to my mind early in the rebellion that the North and the South could never live at peace with each other except as one nation, and that without slavery. You see, so here we are, we're skating something that even we're skating today to a certain degree, right? And I described this when I was talking about Lincoln, and I used, and the only example that I could, that I thought was a reasonable analogy, and it's not a reasonable analogy because we're talking about people who were enslaved, right? Which I guess nothing can really compare to. But if somebody 100 years from now and looks at me, who considers himself, I consider myself to be, I mean, I want to have a clean planet, you know. I want to do whatever I can in to support what I would consider ecology, to use a phrase. But I'm still driving, gasoline powered automobiles, right? I mean, even, high efficiency ones, I mean, cars that get 30, 40 miles a gallon, which compared to the cars that were around when I grew up that got 10 to 15 miles a gallon, I mean, it's an incredible vehicle regarding what it's emitting and how much gas is using. You see what I mean? So there's always that point of context. But to somebody from 100 years from now, who is in a barren planet that's been destroyed by, I don't know, let's call it climate change. They're going to go back in history and look at me, and they're not going to give a hoot about any of the sentiments that I had, that I favored environmentalism, as generally speaking, because as soon as they found out that I was driving gasoline powered automobile or any kind of fossil fueled anything, I lived in a house for two people and two cats that had its own furnace and everything else like that on a half acre of property. I would have been one of the people responsible for the destruction of the earth. You see what I mean? I would have just be thrown right into that category. Nobody would care whatever my sentiments were or anything else like that. Either I was part of the problem or I wasn't, you see? So, and that's kind of like what we do looking back at this period for Grant to see himself as the right side of sentiment, right? And if there was something he could do about something, he would. Today, what we're expecting from our current figures and figures from the past and what we blame them for, all the way from George Washington right to this, is like, why didn't you become an activist and do something about it? You see? So Grant, as you can see, isn't an abolitionist, but he was against slavery. He just wasn't an activist, you see. Now, as it turns out, his wife, Julie, she had to keep her mouth shut too, because she didn't like the practice of slavery either, but they both had to deal with the father-in-law and her father, you see. And so the fact that he acted in his own right, Grant, and Julie was obviously on the side of Grant on this, and they treated people, for the time benevolently and without prejudice for the time, right? By today's standards, that's not enough, you see. The same thing with like a George Washington a generation before, or two generations before. It was George Washington in his will freed his slaves on his deathbed. He freed his slaves, but that doesn't count as doing enough, you know. Right. So here are three famous generals that operated as a team. When what happened here is the Grant was seen as winning battles on the Mississippi, right? That's called the Western Theater in the Civil War, right? And whereas McClellan, who we discussed last time also, he was not, he was winning battles in the East against Lee, but he wasn't going to win the war. He wasn't proactive enough. He wasn't dogged enough. He didn't stick with it when he had him on the run. That's what Lincoln needed, because as I explained last time, Lincoln was in a position politically where if he didn't demonstrably show that the Union was winning, and this was a done deal that he could deliver, Lincoln, then he was not going to get reelected. And indeed, the United States would have been the South would have seceded from the United States of America, and it would have been two countries, or the United States would have remained a slaveholding country indefinitely, and which would have literally changed the history of the world, of course. And so, for the first time now, when Grant got put in position, right, because of his recognition that he was doing such a good job in the West, Grant was hired as the guy who was now in charge of to go head to head with Lee. And they had a unified command now. See, now you had an overall strategy, which you never had in the Civil War before. Grant was an excellent organizer. See, that's the irony here. Irony, listen to me. Irony here is that from all of the military things that Grant could do very, very well, as far as strategy is concerned, as far as logistics is concerned, and everything else like that, in Washington, D.C., he was completely ineffective, right? Because it wasn't a military command structure. It was literally well, I don't want to use the word corrupt, but it was a political structure where people could get away with murder if they covered their tracks. And there was no accountability. But these three guys in the Civil War were able to actually mount an offensive combined across all theaters of the war to strategically defeat the South. All right. Now, we do a program on the Civil War. I'll be happy to talk about those things. As a matter of fact, I think we already did. Hold fast to the Bible, to the influence of this book. We are indebted for all the progress made in true civilization. And to this, we must look to our guide in the future. Now, that was a typical kind of statement for the day, because in the 19th century, many of the offenses worldwide that we look on, that we say Western European colonial empires oppressed other peoples. I mean, we felt as though in the 19th century that white Western European Christian culture was a high point of civilization. And therefore, in for this from the standpoint of evangelical truth, it was our job to spread Christianity to those who didn't have it. You see, now today we see that as imperialism. We see that as the oppression as of lesser peoples, of like this tremendous, colonial abuse of power, right? But in those days, we were doing the godly thing. Now, of course, it's rooted in a certain kind of an arrogance that our society is better than their society, right? Because you don't have God, you don't have Jesus, but you also don't have education, running water, or medicine. And during my adult lifetime, it's been a reverse of all of this, saying that, white Western European civilization should have left things alone, because left alone, those other cultures were actually superior than ours, right? That was called multiculturalism, and it's been the root of education since I've been an adult. Hold fast to the Bible as the sheet anchor of your liberties. Write its precepts in your hearts. Practice them in your lives. No other terms than unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works, right? This was in one of the famous battles in on the Mississippi. And he was, he became famous during this period of time in the Western theater of the war. And he became U.S. Grant. His nickname became Unconditional Surrender Grant, right? So he wasn't taking no for an answer. We're going to kick your asses. And you had these other people. I remember it was the age of chivalry, so you have these Confederate generals come to visit him, saying, all right, you've got to surround him, right? And then the Confederate generals, they looked at Grant and they saw him as their equal, you know, maybe because they were a better student at West Point. Remember, all of the Confederate generals, they all went to West Point, and they all knew that they graduated at higher stature than Grant ever did. And they looked upon him with a certain kind of contempt. And he turned to them and he said, either you're going to surrender everything or we're going to come in there and destroy you. You see? So it was very ballsy of him. And that's what Lincoln liked about him. The South degraded labor, kept it in ignorance, and enervated the governing class. Labor of the country was not skilled nor allowed to become so. The whites could not toil without becoming degraded. So that last sentence was what he experienced when his father-in-law gave him a slave and he worked alongside the slave. Whites could not toil without becoming degraded. It was a separated society. Only the blacks were supposed to toil. The whites were supposed to be sitting there drinking, I don't know, what are those drinks? Mint juleps, or, I don't want to get too stereotypical, you see? And he felt that was just wrong. The art of war is simple enough, Grant says. Find out where your enemy is, get at him as soon as you can, strike him as hard as you can, and keep moving. It's simple enough. Damp. We're going to get bigger and louder until the world explodes around us. Hard rock and hard liquor. Let's speed it up so we'll get there quicker. I find that one kind of fanciful. It's got kind of like this dry sense of humor. Venice would be a wonderful city if it's ever dried. Here's an American stamp, once again, United States postage stamp, 5 cents. So this is a commemorative stamp of the end of the Civil War at Appomattox between Lee and Grant, right? So it's 1865. So this stamp was issued 1965, right? Civil War Centennial, Appomattox. Another stamp, your forever stamp. This is a very critical part of our history. Very, very critical. Grant and Lee. Grant came in late. Lee made sure that he was where he's resplendent in his best uniform with his yellow sash and everything else like that. Grant kept him waiting. And then he comes clunking in with muddy boots and everything else like that. That's psychological, by the way, all of that stuff, the way you do that. It's power positioning. I was successful because you believed in me. That he's talking about his wife. I don't underrate the value of military knowledge, but if men make war and slavish obedience to rules, they will fail. In other words, I don't care what it says in the book. This is what has to happen. I never advocated war except as a means of peace, Grant says. Right? So here's another stamp, United States postage, right? Our country has changed a lot. I mean, it was very, very dynamic period of time in 2020, if you recall that. We had the stressors of COVID, of course, COVID-19. And then, of course, we had George Floyd. I mean, it's a pivotal time, right? People are going to be writing about that and look back on that long after I'm gone. And, but, Grant and Lee, that is something that this entire thing about the Confederacy has needed to be literally canceled. In every battle, Grant says, there comes a time when both sides consider themselves beaten, and then he who continues the attack wins. Right? So a lot of this stuff you can apply to business, you can apply it to your own personal philosophy of success of life, right? My family is American and has been for generations in all of its branches, direct and collateral, right? So we have George Washington's pride that we here in the New World are in a more sacred place than the other places that we left behind in Europe, fit with corruption and all kinds of religious wars and everything else like that, that we here on the new shores are part of something unique and promising, right? This was the opening lines of Grant's memoirs. My family America is American. If you cannot win fairly, just win. The distant rear of an army engaged in battle is not the best place from which to judge correctly what is going on in front. Now, for somebody, I started this history gig as a military historian, right? Which I did for 9 straight years, right? So 30 years later, I've done all kinds of other histories, biographies, etc., today's included. But if you study Vietnam, if you study the war in Afghanistan, if you study the war in Ukraine, you understand what the term incrementalism means, right? For somebody like General Grant or President Grant, right? Later, if you're going to fight, you fight. If you're not, if the goal isn't to win, or you can't tell me what victory looks like, at least, even if it's not a military victory, it's a political victory. Tell me what victory looks like, but just don't keep adding things incrementally over the course of years so that you have this massive stalemate 5 years from now, except now it's with 500,000 people dead, you see? And so when things are actually managed from Washington, D.C., and micromanaged out in the field, then the commanders in the field don't have freedom of action. You see, and you can't fight a war like that. There's a lot of examples of this pro and con, right? But you can see what he's saying for it. You've got to be out in front. You've got to be the person there. The troops need to see you and know that you're there fighting. This is where the decisions have to be made on the battlefield. The friend in my adversity I shall always cherish most. I can better trust those who help to relieve the gloom of my dark hours than those who are so ready to enjoy with me the sunshine of my prosperity. So, there we have the age-old story of, right, people are your pals when you're successful, but when you're down, they kick you. No other terms than unconditional surrender and immediate surrender. I do not think there was ever a more wicked war than that waged by the United States on Mexico. I thought so at the time when I was a youngster. Not only I had not the moral courage enough to resign. And that's a pretty heavy statement, don't you think? I know only two tunes. One of them is Yankee Doodle, and the other isn't. I don't know. It's kind of like funny in a sense, Like I said, he's got kind of a dry sense of humor. Cheap cigars, come in handy. They stifle the odor of cheap politicians. So you see how he feels about that. My oft expressed desire is that all citizens, white or black, native or foreign born, may be left free in all parts of our common country to vote, speak, and act in obedience to law without intimidation or ostracism on account of his views, color, or nativity. 1862. 72, beg your pardon. This one's a repeat. I'm sorry. Labor disgraces no man. Unfortunately, you occasionally find men disgracing labor. In politics, I am growing indifferent. I would like it if I could now return to my planting and books at home. He couldn't wait to get out of Washington, D.C. He couldn't wait to get out of politics. My failures have been errors in judgment, not of intent. Not that that's going to help you. All right, so here he is. Well, I showed you this photograph earlier. All right, we got 4 minutes left. Here's what happens. He's got throat cancer, right? Actually, let me start one step before the throat cancer, right? In this photograph, he's got throat cancer. After Grant is done being president, he's a private citizen, right? By the way, he's not considered a general anymore, so he doesn't have a pension or anything else like that. That wasn't the rule back in those days. But he is a wealthy man. He's a wealthy man, or he thinks he's a wealthy man because his son, Ulysses S. Grant's son, is partners with a guy. Nuts, I forgot the name of the guy. Forgive me. Ward. His name was Ward, right? So they had this financial organization of Ward and Grant, or Grant and Ward. I don't remember, right? It's like a big Wall Street firm, right? I don't know if it was on Wall Street, but I just said that. It's in New York City, right? And the son, Grant's son, is partners with this guy Ward, who's supposed to be a financial genius, right? And all of the money in the Grant family, including all of the money that Grant has and his wife has, is all invested. Now, Grant walks in thinking he's a millionaire, right? Because these financial investments are going so well. So he walks into the office one day thinking he's a millionaire. He walks out having the net worth of $80, $80. And his wife, Julie, she's worth about $130. Okay, so the guy is like flat out broke. He's an old man now. What the hell is he going to do? By the way, what happened was Ward, who went to Sing Sing, by the way, for financial crimes, turned out to be the Bernie Madoff of that era. Once again, Grant finds somebody who turned out to be a complete fraud, and it destroys his family financially. And then right after that, he finds out he's got throat cancer. Now, which of course, back in those days was a death sentence. The guy had like a growing tumor that was metastasizing, right? And you're going to be dead. So remember the relationship between he and Julie? There's no way he's leaving his wife destitute after he's gone and not being able to live. No way. So he makes a deal with some magazine. I forgot the name of the magazine, to write some articles about, it would be interesting. Somebody's got to still be interested in the Civil War, or maybe the fact that he was president twice or something, right? Grant is walking around saying, well, who'd be interested in hearing my story? You see, that's how self-effacing he is. And then he for the same magazine, he signs a contract to write a book-length memoir. Now, once this is out and it's news, okay, Grant gets a visit from somebody who is an admirer, right? And that is one Samuel Clemens, known, of course, as Mark Twain. Now, Mark Twain has its own publishing house, and one might say that he's kind of famous, right? If anybody knows about writing and how to publish something that is written, it's going to be Mark Twain. Mark Twain, as an admirer of Grant, comes to Grant and talks Grant into actually negating on his contracts, which Grant didn't want to do, by the way, because he's a man of honor. And what Mark Twain does, he promises Grant that you write these memoirs. I will make sure that they get published in an organized fashion and they become, I don't know, bestsellers. And I will handle your finances right now. I will make sure that your wife is taken care of. So Grant goes with Mark Twain's deal. Grant spends the next period of time writing constantly. He's in incredible pain. He can't swallow. He can't talk. He can barely breathe. When Grant died, he weighed approximately 100 pounds. But he does not die until he is done writing the memoirs. And they're written so clearly that they barely needed to be edited. It's incredible. And these memoirs are still in print today, as they have been continuously since Mark Twain published them. He dies within a week after finishing the last word of those memoirs. He does it out of love for his wife and his devotion to a duty that he felt he needed to accomplish. So the last two battles that he showed the same tenacity and the same forthrightness and the same, I'm not giving up until it's finished, was his throat cancer and his poverty. Now, posthumously, he eventually, the earnings of his memoirs yield Julia like, I think, $450,000 in 19th century money. Right? I don't even know. I can't even imagine how much money that would be in today's standards. But that is Grant's last deed. And he did it for his wife. And he never thought that anybody would be interested in them. Of course, he's buried, right? You know, here's the joke: who's buried at Grant's tomb, right? And this was enormously attended. This is the largest, most expensive mausoleum, like for anybody in the United States anyway. And then during his funeral procession, there were Confederate brigades going down, I think it was Fifth Avenue or whatever it was, to show how Grant was so instrumental, and the South respected him. You see, for this for the sentiment of that policy of tolerance to them, right? And pallbearers, you had two Union generals from the Civil War as pallbearers, and two Confederate generals from the Civil War as pallbearers. That's respect. My final slide to you, this one I thought was kind of whimsical. Like many other stories, it would be very good if it were only true. Well, that's my program for you today. It's remarkable how fast an hour and a half goes by. And as always, it's a privilege to spend this time with you. And I'm grateful that you've signed up for my program. I very much look forward to seeing you next time. All right. So I'm going to sign off now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.